If the subject responds to the sense of responsibility, she acts with integrity, as this is consistent with her nature as perceiver of possibility. On the other hand, if she turns away by denying the choice, this affects a diminution of her being. This diminution is perceived as a loss at a cosmic level, because individual consciousness knows itself as a manifestation of the universe. This is why even a simple immoral act is characterized by a peculiar sense of grief. The weight of the moral decision thereby motivates us, as it goes to the heart of what we are. Viktor Frankl gives an example of this compulsory aspect of the moral sense in his account of an interaction with a Nazi's concentration camp guard. The guard mistook Frankl, being a physician, as coming from a privileged background and thus worthy of abuse. When Frankl revealed to him that he had done most of his work in clinics for the poor, the guard threw himself on me and knocked me down, shouting like a madman. Acknowledging the moral sense with metaphor. Every objective formulation has a moral dimension, merely by virtue of its evocation of awareness of possibility. By virtue of this awareness alone, one is made aware also of responsibility. But an objective formulation can be made into a moral proposition, per se, by formulating it so that it poses the question of responsibility directly. This is accomplished by the use of terms, such as should or ought. The peculiar feature of these terms is that they combine the notion of obligation with the future tense, and in so doing pose the condition of responsibility for possibility. For instance, the proposition, "one can be kind to others," is turned into an explicitly moral proposition with, "one should be kind to others." The power of the well-formed moral proposition lies in combining evoked perception of possibility with the proposition of the subject's responsibility for it. Moral persuasion in evoked perception. Because the moral act is a response to possibility as it is perceived, rather than to specific possibility, there is an inherent ambiguity in all moral considerations. A moral proposition need not coerce the subject with logical necessity, for the perception of possibility itself will carry the force of persuasion. If the moral proposition does not precipitate a sense of consequence, it will carry no moral weight, regardless of the philosophical or logical weight of its argument. The logical argument serves merely to precipitate awareness of consequential possibility, and thereby to evoke the moral sense. The purpose of the moral proposition, therefore, is to precipitate perception of consequential possibility, and in terms that implicate the actor's responsibility. Various formulations rate as more or less morally powerful by the degree to which they precipitate this awareness. This is the creative work of the moralist. An example in medicine is the difficult question of elective abortion. The statement that abortion kills a life precipitates a perception of possibility that is deep in its ramifications. This is because life is a term that we apply to our perception of the deepest manifestation of possibility. Therefore, it precipitates the deepest sense of responsibility. But the question of abortion does not entail only the cessation of the life of the fetus. There is the human possibility to be explored in the quality of life of a term birth, and the quality of the life of the mother. The moral actor has responsibility for these ends as well, by virtue merely of knowing of them. As the psychoanalyst Magna Dennis said, in her account of her observations in an abortion clinic, there is no way to deny that abortion is a type of murder, but there also, in quotes, is no way to say that it would not be just as surely murder, more cold and vengeful, to force little Flo to give birth to her bastard. Close quote. One might defend the life of the fetus or of the mother. The moral persuasion, the sense of which choice is less bad, will emerge from the relative weight of the perceived possibility. This persuasion will follow from the effectiveness of the moral argument in precipitating this awareness. What the physician needs from the moralist, therefore, is not the right moral code, but the formulation of moral code that elicits deeper perception of possibility. The reconciliation metaphor function. The artificial split between subject and object in mind that is characteristic of consciousness causes the subject to become estranged from its ground in possibility. This is because the purpose of the split is to redirect the attention of the subject away from direct apprehension of the domain of possibility in which she partakes, and toward the object instead, as the means of grasping this possibility. The subject may retain a sense of her participation in the cosmic domain of possibility. As Tennyson said, she may know that she is born to other things, but she is able to see in mind only the material object as the given agenda of thought. This limited view leaves her with the question, Why am I here? In other words, what is it to which the subject is essentially drawn, and for what purpose? To address this need for reconciliation, the mind invokes a special kind of metaphor and metaphor induction that serves as a counterbalance to the Cartesian dualistic frame. In this case, a root metaphor is applied to grasp perception of the domain of possibility in its entirety, and specifically, in a form with which the subject can interact for reconciliation. This metaphorical grasp of the entire domain of possibility takes various forms, such as the Hindu Brahman, or the Buddhist Dharma, or the Chinese Tao, or the personal God of the monotheistic religions, or the naturalistic universe of Spinoza. It is not mere coincidence that all of these metaphors pertain to a religious tradition, for what we call a religious tradition is simply the attempt to accommodate the subject's sense of her origin and role in the primal domain of possibility. In parentheses, religion, religigar, to put things back together again. Close parentheses. This application of metaphor is essential for the reconciliation of the subject to its ground in possibility. As Voltaire famously said, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. What is called God? Of course, Voltaire's proposition was intended to suggest that the psychic need of God renders authentic religious belief dubious. Possibility theory, on the other hand, looks upon this psychic need as the meaning of the notion of God and of similar attempts to grasp this primal domain. The question for us, then, is not whether God exists, but what does God mean? In terms of each of the reconciling root metaphors above, the entire domain of possibility is projected as an object apart from the subject in mind, and in a form with which the subject can interact. Through the resulting subject-object interaction, the subject seeks to reconcile herself to the domain of possibility, what Tillich called the ground of being, of which she knows herself to be a manifestation, so to reorient her behavior, thoughts, and expectations with regard to this source that defines her. Each metaphor supplies its own peculiar set of categories in terms of which the subject works out this interaction. For instance, if the domain of possibility is contrived as a personal God, as in the monotheistic traditions, this interaction might take the form of an effort at interpersonal communication, such as prayers of petition, supplication, intercession, or worship. Through such prayers, the universe reconciles itself to itself through the individual consciousness of the knowing subject. As the Christian mythology says, God was in Christ, reconciling himself to the world. Similarly, if the metaphor takes the form of a dynamic creative force, such as Brahman, the subject-object reconciliation may manifest as the subject's acquiescence to its identity as an expression of this universal principle. As Ryuichi Abe said in his introduction to the Buddhist text, The Awakening of Faith, individual consciousness, quote, represents the absolute as it is expressed in the temporal order, close quote. Conversely, in the case of the naturalistic God of Spinoza, or the static principle of the Chinese Tao, reconciliation of the subject might manifest as fidelity to a non-personal cosmic structure. God experienced as possibility. As in all the other areas of subject-object interaction, through metaphor induction at which we have looked, the domain of possibility gradually will reveal its nature through this dialectical interaction. The description of this nature develops in terms of the categories of the chosen root metaphor. For instance, a personal God may be found to be just, or loving, or demanding, or Brahman may be found to subsist within all of reality. In each of these cases, the characteristics or manifestation of the divine realm will evolve toward its nature as open-ended possibility. But here, in the case of the divine, there is an important difference from other instances of metaphor induction at which we have looked. As the metaphor of the divine refers to the domain of possibility, interaction with the myth of God exists entirely at the level of possibility. As Tillich said, quote, everything divine transcends the split between potentiality and actuality, close quote. This places the notion of the divine in conflict with a hypnotic feature of metaphor induction that posits all objects, including God, as a discoverable actuality in the world. This creates a problematic dynamic between faith and lived experience, since the actual features of the world, such as suffering, are felt to be inconsistent with the intuited characteristics of God, such as love. This problem was referred to by Leibniz as the theodicy, the expectation of the actuality of features of the divine in the world, manifesting as the pervasive sense of providence, creates the conditions for existential frustration, even resentment. Even Sartre himself at the end of his life confessed to Simone a feeling of cosmic purpose, with reference to, while at odds with, his atheistic philosophical agenda in this quote. Even if one does not believe in God, there are elements of the idea of God that remain in us, and that cause us to see the world with some divine aspects. I don't see myself as so much dust that has appeared in the world, but as a being that was expected, prefigured, called forth. In short, as a being that could, seems, come only from a creator. And this idea of a creating hand that created me refers me back to God. It is there, floating vaguely. Close quote. Seen from the perspective of possibility theory, faith is an affirmation of possibility, deeper than, and as the foundation of, actuality, but not dependent upon it. Therefore, the sense of providence, as our relation to the domain of possibility, must be recast in terms of the Stoic notion of the courage to live with uncertainty regarding actuality. The myth of discovery, having introduced possibility theory and metaphor induction as they manifest in scientific, social, and medical decision-making, a final task remains for us. We must create a window to awareness on the part of the decision-maker that the objective decision, in that it appears given as the end in itself, is thereby serving an end beyond itself, in the grasp and actualization of human possibility. That is, we must show how the discovery language of objective science functions as a myth for the decision-maker. Therein we can close the loop between the art and the science of medicine. End of this section.